Waraguan, good evening to you in the Caribbean and the Americas. Good morning and good afternoon to those of us who are Zooming and Facebooking from other parts of the world. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. For those of you who are on Zoom, we now post poll questions on your screen for you to kindly answer. Those questions will help the eDARE team plan future events. This is the second of 3 eDARE webinars for the Caribbean and Americas regions, in which we reflect on the challenges and opportunities of COVID-19. In addition to climate change and racism and sexism and all those other isms of our time, COVID-19 is part of our life context. And these webinars aim to help us reflect on how we might navigate our unprepared, unhealthy, and uncaring societies and churches during this time. One of the moves that eDARE is intentional about is to encourage crossing. So Caribbean presenters address African audience and Asian Pacifica presenters address the Caribbean and the American audience. So that has happened in our first session, and it's happening in this session as well. This evening, 3 people will help us think about how to respond to COVID-19 from across our national borders and the challenges of talking about God and talking about who we are as compared to what we have in the new normal. Our first presenter is Christine Pei. Christine is chair of the Religion Department and Associate Professor of Religion and Ethics and Women's and Gender Studies at Denison University in the USA. Michael Mawson is Senior Lecturer in Systematic Theology and Ethics at the United Theological College within the School of Theology of Charles Sturt University in Australia. And our third presenter is Upolu Va'ai, who is the Principal and Professor of Theology and Ethics at the Pacific Theological College in Fiji. So a warm welcome to our presenters. And I invite Michael Chagasa, one of the sons of the Caribbean, who is currently the CWM Mission Secretary for Europe. And part of his responsibilities include, and I use his own terms, his own label here, part of his responsibilities include being the bottle washer for the eDARE program of CWM. And I'm inviting Michael to offer a short message on behalf of CWM. Michael.
Thank you, Sione. Friends, to this Caribbean and Americas eDARE webinar, I bring you greetings from the Council of World Mission, its Secretariat and Board of Directors. A worldwide partnership of Christian churches, CWM is committed to daring, boundary-pushing, radical and prophetic engagement, and working in partnership geared at reimagining new, renewed, life-giving, and affirming ways to live out the shapes of God's vision of life-flourishing communities. People of the Caribbean and the Americas are no strangers to pandemics. The endemic and syndemic reach of colonialism and its ongoing legacies are still with us in this region. Yet we rise up, knowing we are not alone. So from this CWM region, of one of the first multicultural experiment, an ongoing playground of pirating and pillaging, a region of mystery that defies the art of survival, a mind-boggling breadth of religious impulses, and much more. I welcome you, as in the Caribbean we say, with open arms. And I do so in the spirit of Toussaint, Sans Souci, Masio, Nani, Teteri, Makandal, Rachel, Kwamina, Bossa, the Carib Leapers, and remembering the many resistance sites across the regions. So friends, may our listening, may our engaging, and may our conversations be robust, generous, and above all, a witness to full life for all. Welcome. We honestly mean it.
Thank you, Michael. Our structure for this evening's webinar is we'll start by presentations by our three presenters, and then we will have our Q&A. And for those of you who have any questions or comments, please put those on the Q&A function of Zoom or send it through the comment section of Facebook. I invite our first speaker, Christine, and she will speak on the topic. The title of her presentation is The War on COVID-19, Gender and Indecent Resurgence, Thinking About God's Solidarity with the Poor. Christine, thank you.
Hello, everyone. In response to the COVID-19 outbreak, many world leaders have provoked war languages as if the entire world fought a common war against the virus. When COVID-19 is considered a form of war, whose bodies are subscribed to death? How do they resist death? Critically reading the gendered aspect of COVID-19, I searched for answers to this question and further contemplate transnational solidarity for a new just world order in the post-COVID-19 era. The COVID-19 era requires the critical interrogation of social structures because one's social location often becomes a determining factor of whether they have life or death in crisis. As politicians provoke war languages, I argue that we need a critical feminist materialist analysis of who becomes neglected, intentionally ignored, and forced to care for others. Subsequently, this analysis unpacks how the poor's death and debilitation during the pandemic are profoundly gendered and sexual. Imagining transnational feminist solidarity to rebuild the new world order in the post-COVID era, I'm borrowing wisdom from Marcella Arthau-Surai's Indecent Theology. All political theories are sexual theories with theological frames of support. War metaphors for the COVID-19 pandemic are compelling enough to quickly get people's attention to the possible danger. On April 5, 2020, Queen Elizabeth ended her public speech with the phrase, "We will meet again." Her speech evoked the famous 1939 World War II ballad, "We'll Meet Again" by British singer Vera Lynn. Donald Trump called himself the war president. War metaphors for COVID-19 are misleading and even dangerous. The metaphors encourage people to look for embodied enemies, conceal the dead people's real faces by digitizing their death, reinforce patriarchal gender ideology that glorifies unethic of care, and concentrate medical resources on treating the virus. Poor people's lives, especially women and children, become more precarious during the pandemic, just as any war destroys these people's lives first. On a surface level, the war on COVID-19 portrays the virus itself as the enemy. However, as right-wing politicians worldwide occasionally called it China virus or the Wuhan virus, the enemy becomes to have an East Asian face. In the meantime, the war metaphor justifies the exploitation of civil servants and first responders. The metaphor produces the dichotomous rhetoric of us and them, which signifies the surge of nationalism across the globe. Although COVID-19 is a global issue that requires a global solution, sovereign nations rely on patriotic nationalism and isolationism. Additionally, the war rhetoric, "we are in this together," erases the real faces of the dying. The global poor, who are physically and metaphorically dying from COVID-19, are predominantly people of color, indigenous people, prostitutes, migrant laborers, domestic workers, homeless people, undocumented immigrants, refugees, and poor old people. It should be emphasized that the virus is not the only cause of death and debilitation of the global poor, but also the neoliberal global market economy, which has been constructed upon white heteronormative patriarchal family ideologies. When heteropatriarchal family values are reinforced in the crisis, an ethic of care becomes violent. A violent ethic of care happens in two contexts, at the workplace and home. Women predominate workforces at caring facilities, including hospitals and nursing homes, where the group infection often occurs. Hospitality industries such as hotels, restaurants, domestic labor, and child care services severely hit by COVID-19 are also predominated by female workers. At home, the burden of caring falls mostly on women's shoulders. In the pre-COVID-19 period, women's care work was already undervalued because it was not considered a real economy. Almost 7 months after the COVID-19 outbreak, the United States overall has regained nearly half of the lost jobs. However, mothers of school-age children, Black men, Black women, Hispanic men, Asian Americans, younger Americans ages 25 to 34, and people without college degrees have slowly recovered their jobs. Significantly, Black women recovered only 34%. Mothers of children ages 6 to 12 have recovered fewer than 45% of jobs lost, while the employment of fathers of children the same age is 70% back. Furthermore, domestic and family violence, gender violence, and feticide have increased across the globe since the outbreak of COVID-19. Many feminist scholars and activists have called the violence against women and girls a pandemic. It is the oldest pandemic. However, the masculinized war metaphor for COVID-19 prioritizes eliminating virus and minimizing the spread of infection. It alienates all other societal problems, including domestic violence and gender violence. COVID-19 is violent, not only because the virus is deadly, but also because political responses to the virus strengthen heteronormative nationalist space for racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence that kills and debilitates the marginalized at a fast pace. What theoretical discourse would we need in preparation for the post-COVID-19 era or living with COVID-19? How can people of faith radically reimagine a God talk that has liberatory power from death, debilitation, and fear? What we need is not a surge of militarized nationalism, but a radical resurgence of the Jesus solidarity movement with the sensitivities to gender, sexuality, and race. I borrow the term radical resurgence from Nishinabek poet, scholar, and activist Liane Beta Samasake Simpson in Canada. Adding radical to the resurgence movement in the context of First Nations in Canada, Beta Samasaki Simpson emphasizes the importance of confirming body sovereignty and taking back resurgence from neoliberalism. Radical resurgence engages visioning, thinking, acting, and mobilizing around indigenous systemic alternatives that respect ancestors, two-spirit queer people, non-binary gender hierarchy, nature, and non-human nations. Beta Samasaki Simpson's radical resurgence reminds me of Marcella Arthur-Surai's indecent theology because of her revolutionary method to rediscover God in indecent theology. Indecent theology might be the radical resurgence of liberation theology in preparation for the post-COVID-19 era. Indecent theology engages sexual metaphors to trace obscenities of God and interrogate the poor's embodied experiences in the neoliberal capitalist world. In these sexual metaphors, Arthur-Surai argues for the homosolidarity of God with the poor who are created in image of God. What we need in order to explore our uncertainties created by COVID-19 is sexual metaphors rather than war metaphors. Through sexual metaphors, we can understand that the war metaphor is the masculinist agenda equipped with the necropower over the poor and even nature. We will never win the war against COVID-19. Instead, sexual metaphors allow us to reimagine the community of faith and God's radical justice that requires to overcome the hierarchical binary system. COVID-19 shows the current global political and economic system's failure, namely the decency that disguises the aggressive masculinist heteropatriarchal global political economy does not work. As Arthur-Surai eloquently speaks, to create an alternative system, we should learn to do theology grounded in indecency, sexuality of the poor, and sexual politics of queer people's experiences. They challenge the system vehemently. They are resurrected again and again after sovereignty's brutal execution of their bodies. An alternative system in the post-COVID-19 era relies on indecent people's survivor wisdom whose sexuality has been demoralized, exploited, and mutilated. This wisdom is well archived by Indigenous women and children, Black womanist and feminist non-binary gender and queer folks, immigrants of color, and poor women. The traces left by these people will pave a way to the radical resurgence of the alternative system of life that has been erased by decent systematic theology and the system in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. You've joined what I feel is a shift in the previous webinars, where we are beginning to see the virus as having something that we can engage with as an opportunity. And that was marked last evening in the Africa and Europe session, where maybe there's something that the virus can teach us. And I appreciate that you're continuing this shift, whether it's intentional or not, doesn't matter. But if we see the virus as something that is indecent, and following Marcella's move, then there's something decent in this indecent virus. So I appreciate what you're coming at this particular point. I will shift now to invite Michael Morrison to see if we can continue this indecent path in his presentation, which is titled "Speaking of God, Unruly God Talk with Julian of Norwich." Michael.
Thank you, Sione. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. By February of 2020, it had become apparent that COVID-19 would not be contained to China and nearby countries. The world was facing a full-scale global pandemic. Many people's initial response, especially in the West, was to begin stockpiling food and other basic items. Stories began to emerge about heated arguments and fights breaking out in supermarkets, often over the dwindling supplies of toilet paper, despite the fact that there were no actual problems with production or supply. Panic buying began causing shortages. The problems caused by COVID-19 have, of course, extended far beyond consumer stockpiling. As well as its direct impact through illness and loss of life, the secondary effects of the pandemic have been catastrophic. Attempts to restrict the virus's spread through closing borders and lockdowns have devastated national and local economies. And this economic situation has disproportionately impacted women, Black and Indigenous peoples, refugees and asylum seekers, and other vulnerable groups. Many of our politicians have responded in ways that again display a scarcity mentality. To take just one example, in a speech in June, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison unveiled his plans to increase Australia's investment in long-range missiles and armaments. And he touted such investment as necessary, quote, to prepare for a post-COVID world that is poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. So in light of the virus and its impact, how do we as Christians, theologians, and activists begin formulating a response? How can we talk about God in the context of a scarcity mentality amidst political appeals to the need for rationalising and defending resources? On the 13th of May, 1373, at age 30, the woman later known as Julian of Norwich received a series of 16 dense overlapping visions, centred around the Passion of Christ as the place of God's abundant love. She received her visions while suffering an unknown illness, believing herself to be on a deathbed. Upon recovering, she wrote down her visions and then spent several decades reflecting upon and writing about their significance. And there's striking parallels between Julian's context and our own. First, she had her visions and wrote her theology in a world being remade following a pandemic. The Black Death or bubonic plague had ravaged Europe between 1347 and 51 while she'd still been a child. And estimates are that a third of the population of Norwich had died directly as a result of this plague. Second, Julian's context was also marked by political protest and revolution, notably the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. She received her visions, Amy Laura Hall writes, during a time when peasants, calling for an end to serfdom, burned buildings and even invaded the Tower of London. And third, as with our context, Julian wrote at a time when political leaders were using both plague and rebellion as convenient cover for accumulating and extending power. So the wider period was witnessing an increased centralization of power into the hands of a small number of monarchies. So there was a rise of authoritarianism of sorts. So this indicates the background of Julian's theology. Even while she makes little direct reference to this wider context, the substance and forms of her writing were subtly contesting many of the assumptions of those holding and exerting power. And this is especially the case, I would suggest, with respect to her central insistence on the sheer abundance of God's love and grace. So Julian's theology witnesses to a God who intimately embraces and lovingly upholds humanity. And it does so abundantly and excessively. And I'll just take one slightly bizarre example. So in one of her more memorable visions of the Passion, she sees copious amounts of blood pouring forth from Christ's wounds after his whipping. And to quote Julian herself, the hot blood ran so abundantly that neither skin nor wound was to be seen, and it was so abundant to my way of seeing that it seemed as if it had been the real thing. It would have saturated the bed with blood and overflowed all around. So in a context where bloodlines were being carefully regulated and the Eucharist highly restricted, Julian has this vision of Christ's blood being endlessly poured out and made available to all. What I want to focus on, however, is a different way in which Julian's theology testifies to abundance. namely through the forms and language of her theology directly. So her dense, complex imagery and language is continually exceeding and disrupting more linear ways of speaking about God and the world. And here I'll just take 3 examples of this. So first, reading Julian as a preacher and performance artist, the womanist theologian Donielle McRae has recently attended to stylistic features of her text. That is the way she uses rhyme, meter, and alliteration. And McRae draws attention to an example where Julian is describing Jesus' death and dying in her 8th vision. So to quote Julian, "And at the beginning, while the flesh was fresh and bleeding, the continual pressure of the thorns made the wounds wide." So Julian deploys her words in a way that's playful and poetic. Second, a certain linguistic excess is apparent in how Julian folds and collapses images and metaphors into one another. She mixes her metaphors. In one reflection, she famously describes Christ as mother, Christ who gives birth to us into joy and endless life. She then proceeds to suggest that as mother, Christ can, quote, lead us intimately into his blessed breast through his sweet open side and reveal within the Godhead and the joys of heaven. So Julian's maternal image, Christ as mother, is then enfolded into Christ's wounds in a way that transgresses gender norms and bodily and linguistic boundaries. And third, Julian deploys explicitly apocalyptic language. The devil, she writes, will be scorned at the last judgment by all those who will be saved, whose consolation the devil greatly envies. All misery and tribulation that the devil would have liked to have brought upon them shall go with him forever into hell. So as with John of Patmos, Julian has visions of a time when the devil and evil will be defeated, when all shall be well, when he shall wipe every tear from their eyes. So what does this mean? So I'd suggest that there's a politics in Julian's abundant, unruly language. And here we might recall Judith Butler's suggestion that regular, common sense language always serves the status quo. To quote Butler, why are some of the most trenchant social criticisms often expressed through difficult and demanding language? So in both Julia's context and our own, utilitarian linear language serves and facilitates the exertion and organisation of power from above. So at least on some level, Julian's very unwillingness to follow the rules of what constitutes good theology or logical thinking is itself a form of resistance and disruption. And I think we could, as Christine's just shown us, we could probably find a parallel of sorts in Marcella Althus-Reed's theology. Okay, so to conclude, what can we learn from Julian's excessive, unruly ways of talking about God? How can her abundant language assist us in the midst of COVID-19 and the challenges that we're facing? And in particular, how does it assist us in unraveling and overcoming assumptions of scarcity and appeals to the need for self-preservation by stockpiling and defending resources? So in the context of the present crisis, some of us will no doubt have options for direct kinds of resistance and opposition. So those of us with a relative level of privilege may have options for contesting language of scarcity and rationalisation explicitly, as well as the ways that politicians are mobilising such language. Some of us will have options to hit the streets, and some of us will be in positions to invoke norms of justice, rights and equality to push back against this rhetoric and these troubling developments. For others, such forms of resistance may not be so viable. So for those living under oppressive regimes or in more precarious situations, resistance and protest will likely proceed in ways that are messier and closer to the ground. And this may sometimes involve deploying excessive, abundant language of the kind displayed by Julian. For all of us, I would suggest Julian shows how speaking of an abundant God and speaking abundantly of God can challenge and displace logics of language of scarcity and competition. So she reminds us that we worship a God whose love is continually transgressing boundaries and hierarchies. And Julian's unruly language witnesses to an abundance that scrambles attempt at economic rationalization and calculation. So in Julian's very last vision, she receives a promise and assurance from God: "You shall not be overcome." These words, she writes, were said very distinctly and very powerfully against the tribulations that may come. And as we too respond in our own context, may we hold in faith that we shall not be overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. The intersections between the papers and the presentations are becoming stronger with your attention to the bizarre, that God is abundant in the bizarre, and the indecency that Christine was appealing to in Marcella's work. And last evening for me, Jim Berkinson was talking about needing to engage with the indigenous spirituality, which is bizarre in the eyes of modern rationalism. And then Miguel thought that what we need is irrational symbol. So these irrational elements are coming together, and I appreciate your contribution. And what's better to talk about or bring us together on irrationality than to bring a Samoan who lives in Fiji to speak to us on Langimalie, the de-one-ification of Pacific theology in the light of eco-relational well-being. Volva Famolmole.
All right, thank you, Johnny. The economic, ecological, and health crisis threatening Pacific livelihoods derives from a pathological old narrative of oneification. We have been taught in mainstream education, especially in our theological schools in the Pacific, to think in terms of compartmentalized categories. This compartmentalized framing has encouraged us to view life through split categories to achieve either one answer or one truth. This single-stranded theologizing has pushed us to define and prove whether God systematically fits into split categories and strands, such as a priori or posteriori, objective or subjective, substance or relation, male or female, process or solitary, heaven or earth. In Christology, we are urged to prove whether Christ systematically fits into categories of either divinity or humanity, center or margin, history or faith. This has disallowed us to recognize the good in the bad, the pleasant in the unpleasant, and the possibility in the impossibility, or God in the suffering. Today, we have many theologies in the Pacific that opt to choose the more powerful categories, such as divine, center, male, objective, pure, solitary, that support the digestion of many peoples and cultures to serve one powerful institution, corporation, or even God. This narrative is ill-equipped, at least from a Pacific relational perspective, to diagnose theological and social problems. To focus on one way of understanding reality is unsustainable, and it often removes God to the realm of lordship and objective logic, especially during pandemics. In the Pacific Itulangi, or our side of the heavens, or our side of the horizon, Langimalie is meaningful when it is approached holistically. Langimalie is the continuous search for harmony that ensures the stability and security of the self, the others, the environment, and the whole cosmos. To achieve a long-term Langimalie, we need to move away from this oneification narrative that normally sorts out life into mere separate compartments and categories. Langimalie has three principles. First is the whole of life principle. This is grounded in our Trinitarian faith, where all of life is structured relationally and transversally. Therefore, the world is an eco-relational household where the life of God flows into ours and ours into God within the same household. It is also grounded in the Pacific eco-relational spirituality, where creation and life are seen as a mat of complex, interconnected phase and strands, both visible and invisible. Pacific people always believe that the earth is part of them. They are family, our blood relatives. We are products of this eco-relational genealogical connection, where one life has a dimension of everything else. Humans, for example, have land and ocean dimensions. The focus, therefore, of Langimalie is on the integrated whole that works only because of the interrelated functions of each part. Therefore, the question is not so much about whether there is one God or one truth or one destination, but rather about how we exist and struggle to understand the integrated multiple eco-relationships that constitute the whole of life in God. Because of this integrated structure of life, we cannot treat topics such as ecology or economy or oikomene on their own. They are deeply interwoven, touching on each other. Langimalie clusters around notions of complexity, multiplicity, and negotiability. Langimalie is achieved because life is never fixed to one direction. We've seen that those who resisted the fluid flow of life struggled to navigate the pandemic flow. Langimalie does not subscribe to the words normal or new normal, because life is perceived in flow and motion. This resonates well with the Samoan wisdom. The wisdom of the wise is negotiable, and the wisdom of the fool is fixed. This is because islanders knew that there will always be disasters in a journey. Therefore, life is subject to refinement, redefinitions, and new complexes of meanings. This is why the dominant single-stranded approach promoted by institutionalized religion and by the market-driven neoliberal capitalism that emphasizes the we have approach does not work during pandemics because it is fixed and unteachable. The Pacific Church Leaders Meeting in 2017 endorsed a timely shift of its ecumenical focus from the unity in Christ narrative to the household of God. The former focuses more on the ecumenism of unity without ecology and economy. The later draws us back to the ecumenism of life, the interconnectedness of the Pacific household that puts the well-being and the whole of life at the heart of faith and development. Second is the we are principle. To start with Trinitarian eco-relationality or spirituality is to start with the spirit of relationships. Because we are part of an eco-relational whole, we only exist because of our deep relationship with each other. We are, therefore we live is the axiom that normally works during extreme circumstances such as pandemics. The focus of living collaboratively and relationally is at the heart of Langimalie. This urges us to shift the questions and discussions from how God lives into how we live. We can only start by defining who we are and what we can do in relation to God and to the world around us. In Langimalie, instead of pushing the question of where is God in the pandemic, or why did God punish us with this pandemic, we may start with a we are question, such as what is our responsibility to each other during the pandemic. During the pandemic, for example, many Pacific families in the rural areas have to fetch water from far away wells and rivers for food and drink. So it's not a matter of when, why, and how to wash their hands as per COVID-19 measures. It's really a question of where to get water or food to survive. But this is where the Langimalie we are approach is critical. Rather than assessing God, it draws us more into reassessing ourselves and our compassionate responsibilities of restoration of others and the place of God in such restoration. COVID-19, therefore, is reimagined as an opportunity of healing together rather than an enemy. Assessing God often results in propagating divine judgments and unnecessary presuppositions that either split God into binary categories or frame others as recipients of divine punishment. The we are simply draws us to focus more on the multiple skills and the resilient ways we already have within our grasp as gifts to heal others instead of what we do not. Third is the harmony principle. Harmony is about how distinct parts work collaboratively to achieve the whole of life, and langimalie of the whole eco-relational household. Harmony here is not a romantic notion or strictly about peace. Rather, it is a tool to identify selfish ambitions and agendas that might pose negative consequences on the whole of life. For example, is the process of seeking wisdom in the islands. Achieving langimalie involves a lengthy and time-consuming process of struggling to consult the complex eco-relational connections and genealogies. Slowness in process is important because it is in slowness that we can recognize the face of the other in the journey, including the recognition of the face of God in the others. A slow process ensures minimum consequences on life as a whole. This involves consultation with the other fellow human beings, the environment, the cosmos, even with the self. So let me conclude by saying that slowness involves stepping back to question ourselves and consult with a discerning and listening resolve, taking into consideration other eco-relationships in the eco-relational household is key to langimalie. The langimalie of the whole during and post-pandemic depends on this de-oneification wisdom process that is common throughout the Pacific. This de-oneification can allow us to reimagine ways and diversify approaches to respond to extreme circumstances in the post-COVID-19 period. Thank you.
Malo Upolu. Thank you to Michael and Christine. You've got us going. I mean, this is part of the drive of this eDARE, is how do we do theology, given the challenges and the opportunities that COVID-19 has given us. And that has been very strong, and that desire has been strong in previous sessions. Just last evening, Beverly Haddad was raising this similar concern. So all the conversation in your presentations are coming in this same kind of motion, same kind of movement as what we have seen in the previous sessions. So our conversation will move in three steps. First, an opportunity for you, the three presenters, to make questions or ask questions or push back as the kind of connection that I hear in your presentation, or you may propose other ways of working or finding traces between your presentation. So who wants to go first? Michael? Yeah, okay, Michael, thank you.
Thanks, Sione. Just to thank Christine and Apollo for their papers, and more than anything, I see rich overlap and connection between them. So I'm sure there are differences that matter. Christine, I was just really struck by the line you traced with how military metaphors cause problems further down. So the way in which that can distract us from attending to what's happening and also sort of lead to certain kinds of exploitation. Just linking it to my paper, I think that's also a useful way for thinking about how a scarcity mentality takes hold. So if we're constantly talking about the virus as a threat that we need to combat and fight against, that creates an atmosphere where we think of ourselves in competition perhaps also in competition with one another, and having to compete in those ways. So I'm not sure if that's a question, but just an observation where I think that drawing attention to that military language is, helps us see all sorts of other things that are going on.
Thank you. Christine, do you want to respond to that or comment?
So it's a different response. I'm glad that Michael brought up the theology of Julian of Norwich, because on the one hand, my son's name is Julian, and then on the other hand, and Julian of Norwich, her theology can be read as an indecent theology too, especially when she listened to people who visited to pray with her, and then the way she embraced the people's suffering is an example of how she embodied indecent theology, especially her passionate love for God, and then her kind of erotic language to explain her relationship with God. So I feel like in time of social distancing during this pandemic, I keep thinking about how to recover this kind of indecency, how to recover some kind of like erotic language that we deeply embedded in Christianity, then how the kind of like a passionate love toward God can actually help us imagine and reimagine the alternative system or alternative way to realize God's justice. And also I'm glad that Upolu brought up the indigenous theology and the indigenous understanding of God. I clearly see that the connection between your paper and mine, because I learned a lot about resurgence movements from indigenous movements. And then the more we engage indigenous people to struggle for their own sovereignty, and we can understand the alternative understanding of sovereignty, and then that alternative understanding of sovereignty in contrast to the militarized sovereignty seems really important for us to reimagine the kingdom of God and to create an alternative system.
Upolu, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, both papers by Michael and Christine, we have intersections in relation to points. What I really like about Christine's paper is really looking at the metaphors. The Pacific Island people are keen with metaphors and symbols, and she raised very important issues in relation to use of language and metaphors, because metaphors can not only reveal what is unrevealed, but also can hurt and destroy. And that is why it's very, very critical to look critically into metaphors and symbols, because most of the languages in the Pacific Islands are very metaphorical and very symbolic. And to use the war metaphors here, it really aligns with a kind of reimagining how we can come together to reimagine or redefine how we use language in our theologies, or use metaphors in our theology, or even within the social structure of life. And I think I thank Michael for bringing in the Julian's, especially the focus on the Passion of Christ. And I think I spoke about the importance of talking more about passions, of talking more about suffering and about the dirt, about the reality of who we are, and rather than talking more about God. We've spilled a lot of inks on trying to define what we do not know, instead of focusing on what we already have to look after each other and to ensure the restoration and healing of our communities in what we already have in our communities, the resilience that our people are already putting up, and the ways that we have been engaging with the ecological crisis and climate change. I think that is very important, and I see that is coming out clearly in both papers.
Thank you. Michael, yes, Michael?
Thanks, Sione. Can I just also say something in relation to Apollo's paper? I love the Samoan proverb, the wisdom of the wise is negotiable and the wisdom of the fool is fixed. And I think that just nicely captures a theme that runs through all three papers, in that it's trying to disrupt, the papers are trying to disrupt linear forms of language and control and open space for multiplicity and complexity, or the ways in which language moves back and forth. I also wanted to ask a quick question, if that's okay. You had the reference to slowness when you were drawing out the sort of harmony principle. A slow process ensures minimum consequences on life as a whole. And I just would love to hear a little more about what it means to embrace slowness as a response to the virus and its spread, rather than just sort of being forced to slow down, something about seeing that as something positive or a way of life.
Upolu?
Yes, thank you, Michael, for the question. I think it relates to the we are approach that I was talking about, because more and more in this, as Pope Francis calls the rapidification of life, where everything is instant or it's rushed, especially within this neoliberal capitalist system, we tend to rush things at the expense of the antilinear kind of approach, where we look after each other, we look after the land, we look after the ocean. So slowness, it's required because it's the only approach that we can take care of the multiple responsibility, multiple relationships around us. Because the more we rush ourselves, the more we lose the face of the many relationships that we are supposed to be responsible for in the community. And that is why the slowness of, and it links to the philosophy of time and space in the Pacific, which I can talk more about it when writing in the paper. But for now, because of the time that was assigned to us, it relates to that idea that the more we slow down, the more we are able to be responsible for others who are hurt, including the victims of the COVID-19.
Thank you. Christine, is there an indecent take on time and space and slowness and putting you on the spot? Okay, well, we'll just keep it in mind. I mean, I do have a political question that you have raised, Upolu, but there are some questions on Q&A and chat. I'll ask Michael Chakaza to bring those into this conversation. I see that you also want to say something, Michael Mawson, but Chakaza, do you want to bring one or two questions and then we'll continue this conversation?
Yes, I'll do that. I'm sure that the colleagues have seen some of the questions. So there's a question that Wanda had posed, and I wonder if she wants to ask it directly. So Wanda is in there.
I think you have to speak on behalf of Wanda.
Okay, I have to speak on that. So I start with the one I have at the bottom here. One of the expressions we hear that makes overcoming the virus so challenging is that we are fighting an enemy that we cannot see. What would Christine's response be to such a comment? We are fighting an enemy that we cannot see. What would Christine's response be? And in terms of Upolu, who mentioned that the increasing challenges some people face in finding food and water and basic needs, a question was posed: how can we respond in a more meaningful way as the need increases and the resources dwindle? And I suspect it goes back to what Michael Mawson was also saying in terms of the language of abundance versus the language of scarcity, right? So that's a question there that any of the colleagues. So If you can start with those two, and then I'll look again at the question from
Okay.
Wanda.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Wanda. Christine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, the question was raised by Mr. Gary Harriott.
Yes.
And we are fighting an enemy that we cannot see. And as I just said, my research is ethics of peace and war. And at the bottom of my research is deeply concerned about how quickly we pick up war metaphor whenever we just face any kind of a crisis. It can be economic crisis, or it can be terrorism, or it can be any like a spiritual warfare. Like whatever we face, any crisis, we easily pick up kind of a war metaphor to unite people under one banner. And then my point was, by using war metaphor, on a surface level, we feel like we can quickly create unity among people who are ready to fight for something, even including invisible enemy. And however, this war metaphor continues to exclude a group of people. And then when we fight for war, when we fight for war on terrorism, we constantly otherize those who are perceived terrorists, usually Muslims. And then when we fight for this COVID-19 virus, usually we exclude those who have Chinese faces. I'm Korean, but I can also be also be seen as an enemy who embody kind of like invisible virus. So my point was, whenever we pick up this kind of war metaphor and war language, we have to be more conscious of what kind of enemy we are actually facing, and what social structures, what even spiritual language and our faith system constantly create this enemy. And in the end, we may ask, do we really need this enemy? Or do we really need this kind of enemy language or war language to fight against this virus? So that was my point in my presentation.
Thank you, Christine. This is a critical point on war and how that justifies this hatred towards Chinese and China and anyone who have some Chinese features. Upolu and Michael, do you want to address this question? Because it has to do with language and metaphor as well. And we can talk about metaphor, but using war becomes like a blindfold for people to not discriminate by not discriminating. Yes, Michael.
So just to, what underlies the language of war, or the war metaphor, is the language of necessity. So it locks us into saying, it has to be this way, in ways that sort of blind us from, other options or other ways of thinking, as I think, Christine's drawn out nicely. And again, in ways that I think run parallel to language of scarcity, or, the need for rationalizing.
Upolu, is there something you want to say about this, or?
Yep, I mean, in relation to most of the islands in the Pacific, it's always non-existent. It's almost non-existent that these things called pandemics or disasters are looked upon as an enemy. Most of the islands in the Pacific, because pandemics and disasters happen every year. And that's why we put together, there's always a strategy throughout the year that communities engage with these ecological strategies to prepare themselves for pandemics or for disasters or for cyclone seasons. There's always that's why there are indicators of pandemics or indicators of disasters or cyclones. And people engage with those indicators, and to ensure that whatever comes, they are prepared for whatever comes to their way. So therefore, it's almost non-existent that pandemics or disasters or whatever are seen as an enemy. they are part of the cycle of this household, where people need to adapt and ensure that they survive, and then follows the resilient process after that. So I think it's very strong because of the political, economic spheres that have mainstreamed the enemy language in relation to disasters, in relation to, but that's sort of very different from the we are relational perspective. Of course, I need to dig deeper into that to justify that, but that is often the case when in indigenous communities.
Thank you. But how would you, okay, I'm going to put you two gentlemen in on the spot. How would you two as males respond to this alternative that Christine has brought from Marcella's work, where, okay, let's this war metaphor is not helpful. Let's try this other metaphor, the sensuality, sexuality, body. Why would you two be open to that from your Itulangi as well as from your abundant of grace with Julian, Michael? Or is this something that only women will do that body thing? Serious question.
No, thank you, Sione. So I think
question. I'm sorry, but yeah.
No.
We have to worry. Yeah.
So I think what I'm trying to do in the Julian paper is just listen to what she's doing. Listen to what she's doing with language. Listening to ways that she's transgressing bodily boundaries and gender norms. So that's that's the position I take, is one of listening, one of trying to be open to ways of thinking and operating that may not be so obvious or immediate to me, as a white male. So that, that's more a posture than a sort of answer, a posture of openness and attention.
I think for me, Johnny, it's not really a problem, because it's also part of this eco-relational worldview. When you look at things from compartmentalized categories, then you will have issues with sexuality, errancy, and that. But if you look at it from a holistic perspective, sexuality is part of family making. It's part of community making, and that's where it aligns with Christine's point of how can we use these metaphors in relation to God, because we can do that from a more holistic or eco-relational perspective, but we cannot do that from a compartmentalized, categorized perspective, because there will be binaries where God and sexuality will always be opposite.
Okay, Sione, can I follow up on
Yes.
the Wanda's question? And so the issue of language comes up, Christine's language of war, and then I'm hearing the language of abundance. Can the language of abundance also be, how can a language of abundance be indecent to people who are already impoverished in a particular, context? So that is something for Michael to think about, Michael Mawson to think about. So the language of abundance versus the language of scarcity, but people actually live in penury.
Yeah.
So whether the language of abundance is a privileged discourse, and then in a way would be a sort of a different kind of indecency to the lives and context of people. But there's an issue of language that is coming up here, which also has appeared in all the previous other webinars that we have had. So if you can hold that, but you also have Wanda's question here, and it's specifically to Christine, but I think it applies to all of us. What would it take to create the transnational solidarity that you propose? In other words, how can theological and theology and practice embrace, or the theological and the practical embrace intersectionality? So I think, Christine, you would have seen that question from Wanda, and you probably would be like to answer it, but other colleagues can also answer it. And Michael, the idea of language of abundance and the reality, the existential context of people will be something you can reflect on.
Who is going to go first? Christine?
Okay, I can go first. And
Mm.
and thank you, Wanda, for raising this question. And as soon as I just saw this question, I realized that I didn't fully develop the idea of transnational solidarity that I really wanted to talk in my paper. So I imagine transnational solidarity based on solidarity among those who are perceived as indecent by socio-political system, or political economic system, and also our theology too. And one thing in terms of intersectionality, there are multiple ways to analyze and study COVID-19. And the important question is, where should we begin the study of COVID-19? And my answer is simple. We should begin to study COVID-19 with the actual body of poor women. Okay. The Marcella Arthaus Wright did not like the term like just the poor people, because like poor people in liberation theology are so idealized, and often these poor people are just simply rhetorical. They don't have real bodies and real lives. So that's why she wants to bring sexuality and gender in the discourse of liberation theology. So in terms of intersectionality, if we want to really study COVID-19 and its real impact on human life, then we have to begin this study somewhere. And then this study can begin with the women. And in my own, you can begin anywhere, but in my own research, I really want to study this research with the body of militarized prostitute. That's the body that I have been engaged with to understand the war, how war has destroyed women's lives in particular. So we have to really engage the real human body, and that is intersected with race, gender, and sexuality. And transnational solidarity, well, there are two levels of a transnational solidarity that I'm thinking about. One is a lot of transnational feminist ethicists and theologians have imagined the community. And then this imagined community is like, there is a community that bring people together to fight against global system of injustice. In that way, we do not simply share the common experiences of suffering, but we share the common political goal that we denounce neoliberal capitalism, and then we want to create an alternative system. And yet this imagined community always had some actual practice. We have a long history of this practice of imagined community. And in my case, I keep thinking about how anti-war feminists have been successfully creating transnational solidarity. And these are all like grassroots organizations in Pacific Islands, in South Korea, and the United States, and Australia, and Japan, and many places. But these grassroots organizations come together, always name the indecency of US military bases, even though our neoliberal system always portrays US military bases as a decent system. So I would say like COVID-19, like as I try to develop the radical resurgence movement, we have to dig into this kind of a hidden history and hidden stories and erase the stories from our own traditions and then the history of activism. So we try to find out like which resources of transnational solidarity practices, then we reimagine and recreate how these practices, the historical practices of a transnational solidarity can be recreated and also researched in time of COVID-19.
Thank you, Christine. And I think it's pretty obvious. If you are serious about transnational solidarity, you need a different person at your White House. But because the way your government is going, it's never going to happen with that. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. There's another question. I know there's the question that has been raised for Michael, but I want to bring onto the table other questions that are perking up here. So Michael, please. Take us on.
There's a question from Althea Spencer, who gets the critique, like all of us, about their militaristic language. But then Althea is wondering whether we can look behind it in another direction to think about the political sources that drive the metaphor. Can the metaphor have other uses? And then it's a double-barrel question. Is the language of love and sexuality that points to some of our primal life forces incapable of generating violence? So that's a question there. Can the metaphor have different uses, and would the language, is it possible that the language of love and sexuality can generate violence, or it's just incapable of not generating violence?
Of course, it can generate violence, and then I use the term like the violent ethic of care. So the ethics of care in general, we just take it as it's a good metaphor. It's something like corresponds to Christian value, and yet a lot of women have been exploited because of love. They have been violated by their intimate partners because of love. So whenever any language, even like love, justice, any language that we use always has some kind of moral values. And then whenever we use certain terms, any terms that are abstract have to be contextualized all the time. That is one approach we can think of.
Thank you.
Mawson?
Just to add to that, it probably matters who's using the language and where, and even thinking about the sort of militaristic language, there's something different about Trump invoking and using that kind of language versus the author of the Book of Revelation, when he's using highly militaristic language to disrupt empire from a sort of post-colonial standpoint. So whether it's sexualized language or militaristic language, it functions differently depending on who's speaking and how they're speaking. So just, Sione, I can come back to the question that Michael was asking earlier, but I'm happy to let things move on if you'd rather.
Okay. And obviously, I think this is important. Well, not because I'm raising it, but because I think it's important. That the metaphor and language, that's one thing, but we need more than metaphors. We need more than metaphors in our condition, and this is part of things that have been raised. When resources are becoming scarce, how do we deal with that lack of resources, that mentality of scarcity that you referred to, Michael? But what the Itulangi Malie that Upolo brought up, but this was really it made a point for us in the Africa session last night, or the last session, where Gerald West came on, and then the electricity went out. Electricity for Gerald West goes out. That means all the settlements around are in darkness. So and we emphasize, okay, all you need to do to face COVID is just, wash your hands. When a mother of a poor child does not have water to give drink to the child, why would she worry about washing her hands when the survival is more important? So food scarcity of resources, how do we deal with that? In other words, yes, metaphor is important. Let's get our metaphor straight. But what is that metaphor going to do to feed the hungry?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just rambling, but yeah.
No, that's great. But so I'd want to make a distinction between scarcity of researchers, scarcity of resources, and what I'm calling a scarcity mentality, or the ways in which people within Western countries, including leaders, are appealing to scarcity to justify closing borders, reducing levels of aid, and all sorts of other actions. So primarily what I'm talking about is how language of abundance can disrupt these false appeals to scarcity and the kind of developments that go on the back of those. And that's not to deny places where there's scarcity or genuine shortage, but rather to say, let's look at what's going on here and be clear that it's very different to what's going on over there. That's just the beginnings of an answer, but it's more a disruption of the latter rather than a denial of the former.
Thank you, Michael. Upolu?
Yes, I think, Johnny, first is language. When we come to language, the use of the word resource, we have to be critical and we have to be mindful of using the word resource, because once we use the word resource as per neoliberal capitalist language, it means that something is available to be used or to be taken. So we have to be careful of using language also in terms of resource. So when we ask the question of the abundance of resources, scarcities of resources, are we approaching it? So it comes with a perspective. Are we approaching it from a perspective of the neoliberal capitalist, or are we approaching it from perspective of the grassroots communities who have their own ways of dealing with scarcity of resources? When I raised the point with in my paper in relation to families who fetch waters from far away rivers, these are part of my families, an experience that I had with my families and I heard from my families. But then they survive because they have their own ways of resilience within their own communities. These are complex ways that we need to tap into, as Christine said, in which we cannot do that from within the dominant frame of things. And because it's so complex, the way they live in rural communities, and they have their own ways of adaptation and resilience, that there is so it's simply saying that there is abundance in scarcity. So within scarcity there is abundance. That's simply to them. Whatever comes with the challenges of life, without food, there is a way for them, and these are some of the ways that we need to dig in more to, especially research, especially in theology. We need to delve deeper into the ways of life in the dirt communities, as I prefer to call it, because they live in a very different world and in a very different way of navigating problems and issues. Even with water scarcity, they have their own ways. Like, for example, just watch the movie that just came out, that was filmed in 2050, and that movie resonates with something that came out in 2015, where a family was using I forgot the name, but it's a tree that they can drink from. But this is a film that was filmed in Samoa in 1950s, but then it came back in 2015, when there was an issue in that village, where there was no water, and then they ended up going back to the trees for water. And I think that's something that I bring in terms of scarcity and abundance, because they are not different. They're interrelated.
Thank you. Michael Chagaza.
Okay, colleagues, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. I think lots of rich thoughts here, and one of the things that I am contemplating, and perhaps as a final word from our presenters, if we think of this radical resurgent Jesus movement, what shape will it take, or shapes, And what will ecclesial communities and theological education have to release in order to make it happen? This radical resurgence Jesus movement. What is it we have to give up in order to make it happen? What is it we have to take on to make it happen? Any final word, final thought, just off the top of our head, or we are thinking about it?
Just perhaps just from my side, this a very Pacific Christianity has a very strong pietistic focus, and it simply that pietistic focus connects or aligns with with a neoliberal and this compartmentalized narrative or oneification narrative. It's something that we in the Pacific really needs to relook at and to reimagine and redefine, which is why I mentioned the Pacific church leaders have opted to change the narrative from the unity in Christ narrative that has dominated ecumenism since the 1960s in the Pacific to the Pacific household of God, where it looks at well-being and life to be at the heart of development in the Pacific, at the center of development. And this is already happening since 2017, and there are already productions or publications that have come out from Pacific Theological College and also Pacific Conference of Churches to address this issue of well-being, because it's a big issue in the Pacific. It's well-being has been destroyed, and by these dominant narratives, especially economic and political narratives in the Pacific. So that's perhaps just coming into this point just to address that, where Pacific churches are actually looking at alternatives from within, alternatives, homegrown alternatives, and learning also from others around the world.
Okay, colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we like to thank you for your presentations, for your input, for the engagement. We'd like to thank our attendees for the questions being posed and for the conversation we have had thus far. And as Sione, who has moderated, indicated that there are connecting threads, not only across your presentation and the way it reinforces, affirms, but also challenge each of us. The connection we can also pick up from the larger conversations around the number of papers being presented and the ideas and thoughts that are being expressed. So we'd like to thank you very much. The final webinar will be at the same time tomorrow for the Caribbean and the Americas, November the 1st. But we like to ask you to please note that the time changed tomorrow night in the US Central Time Zone. I think it will be an hour later, so kindly be mindful of the time change. And it will be a conversation between two Filipino artists, Emmanuel Garibay and Emad Caniedo, and a panel of biblical and theological and cultural critics, Carol Duncan, Crystal Hall, Jackie Hidalgo, Althea Spencer Miller, Ched Myers, Rod Pattenden. And we invite you to join, and please encourage others to join. And also note that we have these other eDARE webinars for Asia and Pacifica, as well as for Africa and Europe, that you may also be able to join. And the information can be found at edare.cwmission.org. And at the end of this session, there would be a small questionnaire and evaluation sheet that we would circulate, and kindly ask that if you could complete it and return it to us. It's a way for us to sort of check how we are doing And we value your insights and your contribution in terms of how we can make it better and make it more efficient. So thank you very much. We tend to end these conversations or webinars in what we call a poetic benediction. And tonight our poetic benediction will be given by Sione. So I invite Sione to do the poetic benediction. After the poetic benediction, the mechanism works in such a way that there'll be a slight pause, and then we would all be dismissed by the mechanism, by the Zoom platform. So Sione, over to you.
Out of darkness, out of darkness. Before the first dawn, darkness was deep and alive. Before the first morn, darkness was the mother of life. Before day one was born, darkness was the home of light. Out of darkness burst out light. Into darkness light reclines. With darkness light journeys in the skies, across lands and seas, and even in the cracklings of leaves. Darkness is gentle, and it incubates limbo nations. It has space for the surplus populations, room for orphans of the digital dispensation, and patience for the disposable generations. Its arms are wide to embrace victims, vulnerable, sick and sickened, black and brown, even the gray and the white, and a host of shades all around. Darkness speaks of God abundantly, and in abundance, God embodies darkness. Darkness allows visions to appear and divisions to the faces of fear. Darkness laughs at the fakes of rationality and cries at the mentality of scarcity. Darkness is daring, the bread of solidarity, and waters spiritual eyes, the current of diversity. It zooms across borders and over nations, but it is not limited to them with occupations. COVID might be among revealers and teachers, but darkness follows the footsteps of tears. Pierce the skies and let Langimalia testify that creation was made with the substance of water, dirt, and the sublime. Seek darkness and find life in dirt and dust. Walk humbly with the fragile and don't be obsessed with the illusions of the divine. After the first dawn, darkness was whitewashed. After the first morn, darkness was lynched in life. After day one was born, darkness was the enemy of light. And then day two dawned out of darkness. Manuya.